Hey there. Tonight we're stepping into a world of back staircases and locked doors, of women who worked 16-hour days in grand houses while the world above them glittered with crystal and champagne. This is the story of domestic servants, fallen women, and the moral panic that swept Victorian Britain like wildfire through a tinder-dry forest. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these deep dives into forgotten history. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now settle in, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake at 4:30 in the morning, not to an alarm, but to the iron discipline of years. Your hands are already moving before your mind catches up, reaching for the worn cotton dress hanging on the peg beside your narrow bed. The attic room is freezing. It's always freezing, and your breath makes small clouds in the darkness. Around you, 3 other maids are stirring in their beds, a synchronized ballet of survival performed every morning in 10,000 households across Britain. This is 1885, and you are one of more than 1 million women working as domestic servants in England alone. You are invisible and essential, below stairs and utterly crucial to the smooth operation of the world above. Without you, breakfast wouldn't appear, fires wouldn't light themselves, and the gleaming floors that reflect candlelight at evening parties would turn dull and gray within a week. The hierarchy of domestic service is as rigid as any military regiment. At the top sits the butler, if the household employs one, a man of grave dignity who controls the wine cellar and the mail staff with equal precision. Then comes the housekeeper, usually addressed as Mrs., whether she's married or not, a woman of middle age who holds the keys to every locked cupboard and closet in the house. She is judge, jury, and occasionally executioner of careers, able to dismiss a maid with a single notation in the household book. Below them spread the ranks: the lady's maid, the cook, the parlor maids, the housemaids, the kitchen maids, the scullery maid at the very bottom, and somewhere in the muddy middle, the between maid who isn't quite anything but does everything no one else will touch. You started as a scullery maid at 14, hands raw from washing pots in water hot enough to scald, feet aching from standing on stone floors for 14 hours a day. Now, at 19, you've climbed to housemaid, which means you light fires, empty chamber pots, dust, sweep, polish, and carry endless buckets of coal up narrow servants' stairs. Your arms are stronger than most men's from hauling water. Your knees are permanently damaged from kneeling to scrub floors. You've learned to move like a ghost through the house, completing your work while the family sleeps, disappearing the moment they wake. The numbers tell their own story. In 1851, 1 in 3 women between the ages of 15 and 20 worked in domestic service. By 1891, that number had only slightly decreased, and service remained by far the largest employer of women in Britain. For girls from poor families, especially those from rural areas, service was often the only option besides factory work or worse. But service promised something factories couldn't: respectability. A girl in service lived in a proper house, had a roof over her head, food in her belly, and if she was very lucky, a mistress who might provide a character reference. That single letter could mean the difference between another position or the street. The supply chain of domestic servants ran like clockwork through Victorian Britain, driven by economics, geography, and desperation. In every market town, registry offices operated as clearinghouses for human labor. Young women would arrive with their few possessions tied in bundles, hoping for a position, any position. Agricultural depression hit rural areas hard throughout the late 19th century. Farming families couldn't support all their children. Daughters were sent to service, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, with the understanding that they would send money home when they could. The alternative was watching them go hungry. Advertisements appeared in local newspapers with clockwork regularity. Wanted, General servant, must be clean, honest, and able to rise early. Church of England preferred. References essential. The requirements could be daunting for a girl who'd never worked anywhere but her family's small holding, who might not be able to read well enough to follow a receipt book, whose references came from the local vicar rather than a titled lady. Registry offices charged fees, a week's wages or more, for matching servants with households. Some were reputable, others were fronts for darker trades, promising positions that didn't exist, taking fees and then vanishing, or, worse, directing desperate girls toward lodging houses that turned out to be something else entirely. The Salvation Army and various charitable organizations tried to provide legitimate job placement services, but demand always exceeded supply. For every decent position, 10 girls waited. The pressure made young women vulnerable to promises that seemed too good to be true, and usually were. Training, when it existed at all, happened on the job. You learned to blacklead a grate by doing it wrong 17 times until your arms understood the motion. You learned to fold sheets by having the housekeeper unfold them and make you start again. You learned which rooms were yours to clean and which belonged to the upper servants by accidentally entering the wrong one and receiving a verbal lashing that left your ears ringing for an hour. Some large houses ran proper training programs, taking on young girls and teaching them systematically. These were the plum positions, though they paid less initially. A year or two at a training house could set up a maid for a lifetime of steady employment. The lady superintendent of the London School of Cookery and her peers genuinely believed they were doing God's work, preparing young women for honest labor. Others learned in smaller households where 1 or 2 servants did everything. These positions were brutal in their comprehensiveness. You were made of all work: cooking, cleaning, washing, child-minding, and occasionally standing in as lady's maid when the mistress went visiting. If you survived a year in such a position, you could handle anything.
Your employment began with a hiring interview that could be mortifying. The mistress would examine you like livestock, checking your teeth, your hands, asking intrusive questions about your family, your health, your religious habits, your previous positions. A missing character reference could sink you immediately. An ambiguous one was worse, leaving you to explain why Mrs. Whatever from wherever had damned you with faint praise. If hired, you signed no contract in most cases. Employment was at will on both sides, though servants were expected to give a month's notice, while mistresses could dismiss immediately for cause. Cause could mean anything from genuine theft to a mistress's bad mood or a butler's wandering hands that you failed to deflect properly. Wages varied wildly by position and location. A scullery maid might earn £8 a year plus board. A skilled cook in a grand house could command £40 or £50. A lady's maid to a duchess might receive more, though part of her compensation came in the form of her mistress's cast-off clothing, which she was expected to remake for herself or sell to supplement her income. Most servants were paid quarterly, which meant a girl starting service had to work 3 months before seeing a penny. The system trapped workers in place. If you left before quarter day, you forfeited your wages. If you were dismissed, you might receive only what was owed, with no notice and no reference. The house provided room and board, uniforms, and sometimes small luxuries like tea and sugar for the servants' hall. But these came with strings. The room was an attic cubicle shared with other maids, freezing in winter and stifling in summer. The board was the leavings from upstairs meals, supplemented with bread and dripping and weak tea. The uniform marked you as property of the house, to be worn only while on duty and maintained at your own expense.
Your world existed in parallel with the family's world, but rarely intersected with it directly. The servants' quarters formed a complete society, underground or tucked into the back wings of the house. The servants' hall served as dining room, sitting room, and court of judgment, all in one. Here, strict hierarchy governed every interaction. The upper servants, butler, housekeeper, cook, and lady's maid, sat at one end of the table. The lower servants clustered at the other. No one spoke out of turn. The butler's word was law. The housekeeper's glance could freeze you mid-sentence. Meals were eaten in shifts. The upper servants dined on the better cuts of meat and the choicer dishes. The lower servants got what was left. Everyone ate quickly and in relative silence, unless the butler was in a good mood and allowed conversation. Political discussion was forbidden. Religious argument was forbidden. Complaints about the family were absolutely forbidden, though everyone did it anyway, in whispers. The kitchen was its own kingdom, ruled by the cook with an iron spoon and a temper that could blister paint. She controlled the stores, supervised the kitchen maids, and produced 3 substantial meals a day for the family, plus whatever the servants received. A good cook was worth her weight in gold. A bad one made everyone's life miserable, including her own. The scullery was hell on earth, a hot, steamy cave where dishes were washed, pots were scoured, and the scullery maid worked until her hands bled. The floors were always wet. The air was thick with steam and the smell of lye soap. Girls who started here often didn't last a month before fleeing to factory work, or worse. Privacy was a luxury you couldn't afford. You shared a bedroom with 3 other maids. You washed in cold water in a basin that served all 4 of you. You dressed and undressed with your back turned, changed your underclothes once a week if you were lucky and had 2 sets, and learned not to notice the sounds of others sleeping, crying, or whispering prayers in the darkness. 1 afternoon a month, you had time off, 4 hours, maybe 5, to attend church, write letters home, or simply walk in the park. These precious hours were supervised by the clock and the housekeeper's stern reminders about curfew. Return late and face immediate dismissal. Return drunk and face immediate dismissal and loss of your character. Return with a swollen belly and face ruin. Romance was technically forbidden. Male and female servants weren't supposed to socialize without supervision. In practice, courtships bloomed in the servants' hall, with the upper servants serving as strict chaperones. A housemaid might walk out with a footman on her afternoon off, always in public, always returning well before dark. Marriage usually meant both parties leaving service, as few houses employed married couples except in senior positions. The rules seemed designed to prevent exactly one thing: pregnancy. An unwed pregnant servant was dismissed immediately, with no reference, often with no wages owed. She took with her the shame of the household and disappeared into the city's shadows. What happened to such girls was spoken of only in whispers, morality tales to keep the rest in line.
William Thomas Stead was a peculiar figure, part journalist, part crusader, part showman. He genuinely believed in social reform. He also understood that sensational stories sold papers, raised circulation, and gave him power to shape public opinion. The Maiden Tribute articles represented both his best and worst instincts working in tandem. His investigation was real up to a point. He did visit brothels, interview madams, and document the trade in women. But he also staged events, paid for scenarios to unfold that he could then report as spontaneous, and glossed over ethical complications in his methodology. The purchase of Eliza Armstrong, which he thought would prove his point, instead became the scandal that eventually landed him in prison for 3 months for abduction. Stead worked with reform organizations like the Salvation Army and the London Committee for the Suppression of Traffic in British Girls. These groups shared his goals but didn't always approve of his methods. Catherine Booth and Josephine Butler, veteran campaigners for women's rights, found themselves both aided and embarrassed by Stead's crusade. The articles created a template for moral panic journalism that persists today. Take a genuine problem, amplify it with selective examples, add dramatic narratives, ignore complicating factors, and demand immediate legislative action. Stead's writing was brilliant, infuriating, manipulative, and effective all at once. Parliament moved with unusual speed. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 passed just months after Stead's articles appeared. It raised the age of consent from 13 to 16, strengthened penalties for procuring and trafficking, and gave police new powers to raid suspected brothels and rescue houses. But the act contained a poison pill, the Labouchere Amendment, added almost as an afterthought late one night. This clause criminalized all acts of gross indecency between males, whether in public or private. It didn't touch lesbianism, whether because lawmakers couldn't imagine it or didn't want to mention it remains debated. But it created the legal weapon that would eventually be used against Oscar Wilde and thousands of other men over the next century. The connection between prostitution reform and the criminalization of male homosexuality wasn't accidental. Victorian moral reformers saw all non-procreative sexuality as connected, a slippery slope from masturbation to prostitution to same-sex acts. Protecting girls from exploitation and punishing men for sodomy were, in their minds, parts of the same project, disciplining desire to fit within marriage, reproduction, and social order. The immediate effect on prostitution was limited. Police raids increased, some brothels closed, others moved or became more discreet. The age of consent rise mattered more symbolically than practically. Proving that 13-year-olds had sex for money or pleasure had always been difficult, and 16 posed the same evidentiary challenges. What did change was the intensity of surveillance. Rescue workers became more aggressive. Police paid more attention to lodging houses and railway stations. The moral geography of London shifted as neighborhoods were labeled respectable or suspect, and anyone working or living in the wrong areas faced presumption of vice.
The panic created an industry. Organizations formed to rescue fallen women, to pluck them from brothels, reform them through training and religious instruction, and reintegrate them into respectable society. The London Female Preventative and Reformatory Institution, the Salvation Army's rescue homes, and dozens of smaller charities all competed for funding and souls. These institutions meant well, mostly. They provided shelter, food, and training to women who otherwise faced destitution. But they also imposed rigid moral frameworks, religious conversion, and labor conditions that looked remarkably like service without wages. Women were expected to be grateful, penitent, and compliant. Those who resisted or failed to reform quickly enough found themselves back on the streets. The homes taught laundry work primarily, hours of standing, washing, ironing, and folding. Laundry was considered suitably humble work, unlikely to give women ideas above their station. It was also profitable. The homes contracted with hotels and institutions, using rescued women's labor to support themselves. Whether this was rehabilitation or exploitation depended partly on perspective and partly on the specific institution. Some women genuinely wanted rescue. A prostitute facing age, illness, or simply exhaustion might seek refuge in these homes. Others were forced there by police raids or family members. The voluntary nature of the rescue was often questionable. Once inside, women faced locked doors, strict schedules, and constant supervision. Escape attempts were common. Josephine Butler, the great feminist reformer, criticized the more coercive rescue operations. She argued that women needed economic opportunities and legal protections, not just moral instruction. Her campaigns against the Contagious Diseases Acts and for women's rights put her at odds with more conservative reformers who saw salvation in submission rather than independence. The discourse around rescue revealed deep anxieties about class, gender, and control. Middle-class reformers often seemed as concerned with policing working-class sexuality as with helping women in genuine distress. The ideal rescued woman was grateful, humble, and reformed, willing to accept a servant's position and never trouble anyone again with her past or her opinions. One of the panic's lasting effects was the establishment of railway station patrols. Organizations like the Travelers' Aid Society stationed respectable women at major terminals to watch for vulnerable girls arriving from the countryside. These volunteers approached young women traveling alone, offering assistance and warning them about procurers and false employment offers. The patrols did intercept some genuinely vulnerable women and direct them to legitimate registry offices or housing. They also embodied a form of class control. Middle-class women policing working-class mobility, deciding who looked respectable enough to be left alone and who needed intervention. A girl arriving from the countryside faced a barrage of people claiming to help her. Registry office touts, lodging housekeepers, philanthropic ladies, actual procurers all mixed together. Learning to distinguish between them required street wisdom most didn't yet possess. Many made mistakes. Some learned from them. Others didn't get a second chance. The moral geography of London became increasingly policed. Certain neighborhoods were respectable, others suspect. A woman living or working in Whitechapel or Southwark faced automatic presumption of vice regardless of her actual employment. Police stops, aggressive questioning, and demands for proof of respectability became routine for working-class women in wrong places. This geographic profiling intersected with the era's anxieties about urban anonymity. In villages, everyone knew everyone. Cities allowed escape from reputation, but also created opportunities for deception. A woman could claim to be a widow when she'd never married, pretend to have worked in a fine house when she'd been dismissed without a character, or hide a past that would have made employment impossible in her hometown. The reformers' solution was more surveillance, more checkpoints, more questions, more documentation. The police gained new powers to demand identification and explanations. Women learned to carry proof of employment, marriage certificates, or letters from mistresses to deflect scrutiny. Privacy became a luxury only the middle class could afford.
The day begins in darkness and cold. You wake to muscle memory rather than desire, your body understanding before your mind that resistance is futile. The attic is so cold you can see your breath. Your uniform, black dress, white apron, cap, hangs where you left it, and you pull it on over your chemise with practiced efficiency. In the darkness, you navigate to the washstand. The water in the pitcher has ice on its surface. You break through it to splash your face, gasping at the shock. There is no time for more elaborate washing. That will come tonight if you have energy left. Down the narrow servants' stairs, you move like a shadow. The house above still sleeps, and your job is to ensure it wakes to comfort without ever seeing the labor that creates it. You pass other servants on similar missions, the scullery maid heading to the kitchen, the parlor maid with her box of cleaning supplies, everyone moving in synchronized silence. Your first task is the fires. The family must wake to warm rooms. You carry coal scuttles up the main stairs. The family hasn't risen yet, so you're allowed to use them, and kneel at cold grates to clean out yesterday's ashes. Your hands are soon black, your knees ache against the hearth. But you work quickly, efficiently, building fires that will catch and burn steadily through the morning. Each fire is a small engineering project. Paper and kindling at the base, coal arranged just so, lighting it in the right spot to ensure it catches properly. You've learned through bitter experience what happens when you build a fire wrong. the smokeback that fills the room, the flames that die before the coal catches, the waste of precious fuel that results in scolding from the housekeeper. By 5:30, you've lit 6 fires and emptied the chamber pots from the bedrooms, carrying them down the servants' stairs to the outdoor privy, a task that never becomes less revolting. You wash your hands in cold water with harsh soap that cracks your skin, then move to the next phase of your morning. Breakfast preparation belongs mostly to the kitchen staff, but you help carry things, the heavy trays of dishes, the silver that needs polishing, the water that must be heated in enormous quantities. The kitchen is the only warm room in the house at this hour, and you linger there as long as you dare, knowing the housekeeper will scold if she catches you idling.
The houses you work in are designed to keep you invisible. Servants' stairs twist narrow and steep behind walls, allowing you to move between floors without being seen. Service hallways run parallel to family corridors, doors cleverly concealed in wallpaper or paneling. The back stairs world is dim and utilitarian. Plain walls, bare floors, no ornament. The green baize door marks the boundary between worlds. Through it lies the servants' domain, the servants' hall, the housekeeper's room, the butler's pantry, the kitchen, scullery, and larder. Your side is all business: stone floors, scrubbed tables, hooks for copper pots, shelves stacked with supplies. Push through the door in the other direction, and you enter luxury. Thick carpets that muffle sound, wallpaper in rich patterns, paintings in gold frames, furniture that costs more than you'll earn in a decade. You're trained to move through these spaces like air, there but not really, visible only when needed, vanishing the moment attention shifts elsewhere. The bells are your constant companions. Each room has a pull cord that connects to bells in the servants' hall, labeled with room names: morning room, drawing room, master's study, mistress's bedroom. When a bell rings, you note which one and respond accordingly. The family never shouts for service. Too vulgar. They ring, and servants come. Learning the household's geography takes weeks. Which stairs lead where? Which rooms you're allowed to enter, and which are forbidden even to clean without supervision. Where supplies are kept, which doors are locked, and where the keys hang. The fastest routes from one part of the house to another. You become a master of back entrances and side passages. Tradesmen come to the servants' entrance, never the front door. You know every delivery schedule: the butcher on Monday and Thursday, the greengrocer on Wednesday, the fishmonger on Friday. You know which of these tradesmen can be trusted and which will shortchange the cook if she's not watching. The spatial segregation extends to mealtimes. The family eats in the dining room at appointed hours. You eat in the servants' hall at different times, often from different food. The separation is psychological as much as physical, reminding everyone of their place, maintaining the fiction that the family exists in a perfect world untouched by the labor that sustains it.
You learn to hate the bells and depend on them simultaneously. They structure your day, interrupt your brief moments of rest, call you for meals that grow cold as you respond to summons. A day might bring 30 bell rings, some for genuine needs, others for trivial requests that could have waited or been handled by the lady's maid or valet. The worst bells ring late at night. After a dinner party, as you're finally sitting down in the servants' hall with aching feet and hollow stomach, the bells start. Clear the drawing room. Bring more brandy to the library. Lady Pemberton needs her cloak. Each ring means climbing stairs again, plastering on a neutral expression, performing service with grace no matter how exhausted you are. Some rings are tests. The mistress suspects you of idling and rings to see how quickly you respond. The butler checks whether you're alert during slow afternoon hours.
The housekeeper rings to ensure you're not gossiping in the servants' hall. Your speed of response becomes part of your permanent record, noted in the household book, mentioned in your character reference. The bells also carry coded meanings you learn over time. A certain pattern means urgency. A repeated ring signals displeasure. Some family members ring incessantly, treating servants as extensions of their own will. Others ring rarely, proud of their own capability or genuinely considerate. You learn each person's habits, anticipating needs before bells ring. The system breaks down occasionally. Bells malfunction, wires snap, and suddenly you're left guessing what's needed where. Or the family has guests who don't understand the bell system and pull cords at random, creating chaos below stairs. These disruptions are almost welcome. They prove you're necessary, that the smooth operation of the house depends on more than just obedience. Serving meals is theater. You practice the choreography, how to enter from the left, remove plates from the right, never reach across a diner, never let your sleeve brush someone's shoulder. The parlor maid carries dishes from kitchen to dining room, timing entries to match the courses. You stand against the wall between courses, hands clasped, face neutral, supposedly deaf to conversation, but actually hearing everything. The dining room is where you learn the family's secrets. You hear financial discussions, marriage negotiations, political arguments, gossip about neighbors. You're trained to be a piece of furniture, but you're human with ears and memory. The family sometimes forgets this. You hear things that could ruin reputations, dissolve marriages, or change inheritance plans. Servants absolutely talk about what they overhear. In the servants' hall, after the family has dined, conversations center on the day's revelations. Did you hear what she said about her sister? His lordship has lost money again. The son is courting someone unsuitable. This information becomes social currency below stairs and occasionally travels outside the house, usually with consequences. The family's food is better than yours, but you live on the leavings. Joints that have been carved, vegetables picked over, desserts half consumed, these come back to the servants' hall. The upper servants get first choice. You get what's left. Sometimes it's generous. Often it's scraps. You supplement with bread, dripping, weak tea, and whatever the cook can spare. Your own meals are rushed affairs. You eat in shifts, never all together, always ready to abandon food mid-bite if a bell rings. The housekeeper inspects portions to ensure no one takes more than their share. Waste is a sin, but so is greed. You learn to eat quickly, strategically, storing energy for the long afternoon and evening ahead. The kitchen is simultaneously the most dangerous and most convivial space below stairs. The cook rules absolutely, but she's often willing to share gossip, advice, and occasional treats if you've pleased her. Kitchen maids whisper secrets while chopping vegetables. The scullery maid catches fragments of conversation while scrubbing pots. Information flows through the kitchen like heat from the stove.
Afternoons blur into an endless cycle of maintenance. Dusting, polishing, brushing, sweeping, scrubbing. The house is large and dust is relentless. You work through rooms on a schedule, giving each the appropriate level of attention. Public rooms get daily attention. Family bedrooms are done while occupants are out. Private sitting rooms and studies require special care not to disturb papers or personal items. Dusting is an art form. You use soft cloths for delicate surfaces, stiffer brushes for carved wood, special preparations for marble. Books must be dusted carefully. ornaments cleaned without breakage, pianos wiped down without scratching the finish. You memorize which objects are valuable, which sentimental, which dangerous to touch without permission. Polishing is never-ending. Silver tarnishes constantly. Candelabras, picture frames, tea services, cutlery. You sit in the servants' hall with polish and cloths, working through piece after piece until your hands smell of chemicals and your shoulders ache. Brass door handles and fireplace fittings need weekly attention. Copper pots in the kitchen must shine. Mirrors must be spotless. Windows must be transparent. The housekeeper inspects your work with white gloves and a critical eye. She runs fingers along picture frames checking for dust, examines floors for missed spots, tests doorknobs for proper shine. Failed inspections mean redoing work on your own time, which you don't really have. You learn paranoid perfectionism, checking your own work 3 times because you can't afford to fail. You're also responsible for the family's personal items, shaking out and airing clothes, laying out evening wear, maintaining shoes and boots, ensuring hat boxes and trunks are properly stored. The mistress's bedroom is sacred space, cleaned only by you and the lady's maid. You learn her habits, which side of the bed she prefers, how she likes pillows arranged, the temperature she finds comfortable. The physical toll accumulates. Your knees hurt from kneeling to clean grates and scrub floors. Your shoulders ache from carrying heavy coal scuttles and water jugs. Your hands are rough and reddened from constant washing and chemical exposure. Your feet throb from standing and walking on hard floors. By mid-afternoon, you're already exhausted, and hours of work remain. As evening approaches, the pace intensifies. The family prepares for dinner, the day's main event. You prepare the dining room, laying the table with precision, ensuring every glass and piece of silver is positioned exactly right. The parlor maid lights candles, draws curtains, arranges flowers brought up from the morning's market. Upstairs, the lady's maid helps her mistress dress for dinner. You're not involved in that, thank heaven, but you ensure the dressing room has everything needed: hot water, fresh towels, properly aired garments. The master's valet performs similar services for him. The house hums with preparation. Dinner service begins at 8 or 8:30, depending on the household. You assist in serving, removing covers, refilling wine glasses, carrying dishes between kitchen and dining room. The meal can last 2 hours with multiple courses, each requiring perfect timing and execution. You stand, wait, serve, remove, over and over, feet burning, face neutral. After dinner, the family retires to the drawing room or library. You clear the dining room, wash and put away dishes, or supervise the scullery maid doing it, ensure the downstairs rooms are secured for the night. The family might ring for tea, brandy, or small snacks. You respond each time, climbing stairs that feel steeper with each ascent. The family goes to bed around 11. You turn down beds, warming them with hot water bottles if it's cold, ensuring night clothes are laid out, chamber pots are fresh, water carafes are filled. You bank fires so they'll keep rooms warm through the night without burning dangerously. You make one final circuit of public rooms, ensuring all is secure. Finally, near midnight, you're released to your own bed. You climb the servants' stairs one last time, peel off your uniform, and collapse onto your narrow mattress. Your muscles scream, your mind is fuzzy with exhaustion. Tomorrow, it begins at 4:30 a.m. This is your life. 18 hours of labor, 6 hours of sleep if you're lucky, 1 afternoon off per month, and wages that wouldn't keep a cat comfortable. You know things about the family that their friends don't. You see them at their worst, hungover, arguing, crying, ill. You know which marriages are happy and which are performances. You know who drinks too much, who gambles, who's faithful and who isn't. This knowledge creates a strange intimacy, entirely one-sided. The mistress is your immediate superior, though the housekeeper intermediates most interactions. She might be kind, asking if you're well, giving you a day's rest when you're ill.
passing along old dresses. Or she might be coldly indifferent, seeing you as a function rather than a person. The best mistresses are distant but fair. The worst are capricious, blaming servants for their own bad moods, changing rules without notice, punishing perceived slights with sudden dismissals. Her daughters learn to ring bells and make demands, practicing for their own future households. You watch them grow from children you helped mind to young ladies who ignore you except when needing service. Some remain kind, remembering your name, saying please and thank you, slipping you tips at Christmas. Others become petty tyrants, treating servants as beneath notice. The sons are more dangerous. You learn early to never be alone with them, to avoid dark corridors and isolated rooms. Some are gentlemen who respect boundaries. Others view servants as available for entertainment, grabbing at waists, cornering maids in pantries, expecting compliance because they can't imagine consequences. If you report harassment, you're likely to be dismissed for lying or for being attractive enough to tempt young men from virtue. The family's visitors treat you as invisible until they need something. You perfect the art of standing still, eyes slightly downcast, face neutral, while conversations flow around you. Sometimes they'll speak to you directly, ordering you to fetch something, asking where the mistress is, commenting on household arrangements. You respond with minimal words, never volunteering information, never expressing opinions.
Children are your responsibility when the nursemaid is off duty or the household doesn't employ one. You mind them, play with them, clean up after them, and maintain discipline while being careful never to overstep your authority. The children often treat you better than adults do, seeing you as a person, asking questions, wanting to play. But they're learning class structure, and as they age, distance increases. You witness the family's tragedies, births, deaths, illnesses, financial crises. You lay out bodies for funerals, prepare nurseries for new babies, pack belongings when daughters marry and leave home. You're present for moments meant to be private, seeing grief and joy in their rawest forms. Yet you're expected to forget these moments, to maintain the fiction that you weren't really there. Every household has written rules, posted in the servants' hall, spelled out during hiring, and forced by the housekeeper. No followers, romantic callers, no drinking on duty, no borrowing from other servants, no leaving without permission, no accepting tips from family guests without approval, no reading the family's books or newspapers without explicit permission, no wearing outdoor clothes indoors, no sitting in the family's rooms. The unwritten rules are more numerous. Never speak unless spoken to in the family's presence. Never look directly at the master or mistress unless addressed. Never pass comment on anything you overhear. Never laugh loudly or sing while working. Never show emotion regardless of what's happening. Never admit to being tired, hungry, ill, or unhappy. You learn what triggers each person's anger. The mistress hates improperly arranged flowers. The master cannot tolerate the slightest noise in the morning. The daughter dislikes anyone touching her writing desk. The son becomes angry if his boots aren't perfectly polished. You navigate these preferences like a maze, one wrong turn resulting in scolding or worse. Punishments for rule breaking vary by severity and the household's temperament. Minor infractions might earn verbal rebuke or loss of an afternoon off. Major violations, theft, drunkenness, pregnancy, result in immediate dismissal without character reference, effectively ending your career in respectable service. The threat of dismissal hangs over every interaction, every decision, every moment. Some rules seem designed to prevent joy. You're discouraged from forming close friendships with other servants. The household fears conspiracies or time wasting. You're forbidden to decorate your bedroom. Personal expression is unseemly. You can't receive mail without the housekeeper reading it first. Your movements on your afternoon off must be reported and approved. The surveillance is totalizing. The housekeeper monitors your eating,
spending, correspondence, friendships, church attendance, and personal habits. She files reports in the household book that will follow you to your next position. She judges your morality, industry, and character, knowing that her assessment can make or break your future. Yet there are spaces of resistance. You learn to read family newspapers after they're discarded, hiding them in your apron to read later. You sneak food from the larder when the cook isn't watching. You slip out after curfew to meet a follower, bribing the scullery maid to leave a door unlatched. You gossip about the family, despite prohibitions, small rebellions that make servitude bearable. Even across gender roles, the bonds of service provide an important support system. The footman helps each other with their heavy lifting. The butler covers for you when you're late starting a task. You share food with the scullery maid, and she tells you when the housekeeper is in a foul mood. These networks are your survival, your insurance against the household's indifference. You also form attachments to other servants, to tradesmen who deliver to the house, to young men who work in nearby households. Courtship happens in stolen moments, a conversation at the back door while accepting a delivery, a walk in the park on your afternoon off. Letters pass through sympathetic third parties. You dream of marriage, escape from service, a home of your own. The irony is that service prepares you perfectly for running a household, while simultaneously making it nearly impossible to have one. You know how to cook, clean, manage supplies, and organize labor, but you have no money, no time to court properly, no opportunity to learn anything beyond domestic labor. Marriage seems both tantalizingly close and impossibly far.
Not every girl who enters service stays there. Some are dismissed for pregnancy, for theft, for mysterious offenses the family won't specify. Others leave voluntarily when conditions become unbearable or when promises of marriage disappear. Still others are recruited, persuaded that better opportunities exist elsewhere. All roads out of service are dangerous for women without resources. The pregnant servant faces the worst fate. Discovered, she's dismissed immediately, usually without wages owed, never with a character reference. If the father was a family member or visitor, this fact is suppressed. Mentioning it ensures you'll never work again. You're put out with your box of belongings and nowhere to go. Lying-in hospitals exist for women in this situation, but they're grim places, crowded, poorly funded, with high mortality rates for mothers and babies alike. If you survive childbirth, you face impossible choices. Keep the baby, and you can't work. No household will employ a mother with a child. Give the baby up to a baby farm and risk its death through neglect or deliberate killing. Leave it at the workhouse and never see it again. Many women in this situation turn to prostitution out of sheer necessity. With a baby to feed and no employment prospects, selling sex becomes the only option that offers immediate income. It's not a choice made freely, but one dictated by economic desperation and social exclusion. The Victorian equation is brutally simple. Pregnancy outside marriage equals social death equals literal survival sex. Other women enter prostitution more gradually. A dismissed servant might take lodgings and try to find work, only to discover that without a character reference, employment is impossible. The landlady presses for rent. Food must be bought. Money is gone. The landlady might suggest friendly visits from gentlemen who will pay rent in exchange for companionship. The first time is framed as a favor, a temporary measure. It rarely stops there. Some women are actively recruited by procurers, women who scout registry offices, lodging houses, and railway stations for vulnerable girls. They're skilled at identifying desperation, offering friendship and help, then maneuvering women into debt and obligation. The procurer pays for lodging, clothes, and food, then announces the debt must be repaid through entertaining gentlemen. The recruiting networks Sped described in his articles existed, but operated more subtly than his sensational account suggested. Real procurers didn't need to drug and kidnap women because economic pressure did the work for them. A girl alone in London, unemployed, hungry, and frightened, would often agree to things she'd have rejected in different circumstances. Brothels varied as much as legitimate boarding houses. At the top end, high-class establishments catered to wealthy men, offering luxury, discretion, and women who could pass as ladies. These houses operated in respectable neighborhoods, disguised as private homes, with a madame who enforced strict rules and high prices. Middle-tier brothels were more visible, located in known vice districts, marked by particular color-painted doors or windows dressed in specific ways. These served clerks, tradesmen, soldiers, sailors, men with some money but not wealth. The women here worked harder, saw more clients, earned less, and faced greater risk of disease and violence. At the bottom were the accommodation houses and casual prostitution sites, lodging houses that rented rooms by the hour, streets and parks where women solicited openly, penny gaffs where quick encounters happened in back rooms or alleys. Women working this level were often desperate, old, ill, or addicted, unable to access better situations. Inside a middle-tier brothel, life developed its own routine. You rose late, clients came at night, and spent mornings doing laundry, mending clothes, and preparing for evening. Afternoons might be free, allowing you to walk out, shop, or visit friends. Evenings began with preparation, bathing, dressing, applying paint to face and lips in ways respectable women never would. The madam controlled everything, screening clients, negotiating prices, taking her cut, usually half, providing room and board, and enforcing house rules. Some madams were cruel, keeping women in debt through inflated charges for clothes, food, and lodging. Others were relatively fair, recognizing that happy workers made more money. All were businesswomen first, operating in an illegal enterprise that required careful management. Clients ranged from young men sowing wild oats, to married men seeking variety, to older men whose wives no longer welcomed them. Some were kind, some indifferent, some cruel. You learned to read men quickly, identifying those likely to pay fairly and leave peacefully versus those who might turn violent or refuse payment. The best clients were regulars, who established favorite women and treated them decently. Disease was inevitable. Syphilis and gonorrhea spread through brothels despite precautions like vinegar douches and inspections by house doctors. The Contagious Diseases Acts allowed police to arrest suspected prostitutes and force them to submit to examination and treatment, but these measures targeted women while ignoring male clients who spread disease freely. Violence was always possible. A client might become rough, a robbery attempt might go wrong, or a fight between women might escalate. Police offered little protection. They were more likely to arrest prostitutes than defend them. You learned to watch for danger signs, to keep a weapon hidden, to have escape routes planned. Money drove everything. A successful prostitute in a good brothel might earn more in a week than a servant earned in a year. This created powerful economic incentive despite the work's dangers and stigma. For women locked out of respectable employment, prostitution offered the only path to financial independence. Prices varied enormously. A high-class courtesan might charge several pounds for an evening's companionship. A brothel worker might earn 5 to 10 shillings per client. A street worker might settle for a few pence, enough for a meal or a bed for the night.
Women in brothels paid for everything: room, board, clothes, toiletries, contraceptives, doctor visits. These charges, set by the madam, often consumed half or more of earnings. Women found themselves working constantly, yet never getting ahead, trapped in cycles of debt that made leaving impossible without abandoning everything they had accumulated. Independent prostitutes working the streets kept their full earnings but faced greater risks. They had no madam to screen clients or intervene if violence occurred. They paid directly for lodging, competing in a market where declining looks or age meant plummeting income.
Many independent workers were former brothel women who'd aged out or been cast out. Some women saved money carefully, planning exit strategies. A successful prostitute might accumulate enough to open a shop, emigrate, or buy into a legitimate lodging house. These success stories were rare, but not impossible. More common were women who drifted through prostitution for a few years before dying of disease, violence, or despair. The customers themselves paid more than just the quoted price. Brothels charged for drinks, private rooms, entertainment, and various special services. A man seeking an evening's diversion might spend a week's wages. The brothel captured most of this money, with the women receiving only a fraction, despite doing all the actual work. Prostitution itself wasn't illegal in Victorian Britain, but almost everything associated with it was. Keeping a brothel was illegal. Soliciting was illegal. Living off prostitution's proceeds was illegal. This created a legal gray area where prostitutes technically could work, but practically faced constant harassment. Police raids were regular occurrences, sometimes prompted by complaints, sometimes by reform campaigns, sometimes by officers seeking bribes to look the other way. The raids followed familiar patterns. Police bursting in, usually at night, arresting everyone present, including clients, though clients were typically released quickly, while women were held.
The courts processed prostitutes through specialized police courts with bewildering speed. You'd be arrested at night, held in cells until morning, brought before a magistrate around noon, and sentenced by mid-afternoon. The standard sentence was a fine or a few days in jail. If you couldn't pay the fine, you went to jail. Either way, your earnings were gone and you needed to start over. Repeat offenders faced harsher sentences, weeks or months in jail, followed by pressure to enter reform homes. Some women spent years cycling through arrest, jail, brief freedom, and arrest again. The system seemed designed to punish without rehabilitating, to harass without solving the underlying problems of poverty and limited employment. The Contagious Diseases Acts, in effect in certain garrison and port towns, added medical examination to police harassment. Women suspected of prostitution could be forced to undergo internal examination by speculum, a procedure many experienced as rape. If found diseased, they were confined in lock hospitals until cured, losing income and possibly their lodgings in the process. Josephine Butler's long campaign against the CD Acts highlighted their injustice. Why examine women but not men? Why assume women were disease vectors rather than victims? Why violate women's bodies in the name of public health while ignoring their poverty and lack of options? Her arguments eventually succeeded, and the acts were suspended, then repealed, but not before thousands of women had been subjected to them. Some police officers were corrupt, taking bribes from brothel keepers in exchange for advance warning of raids or lenient treatment. Others were zealously moral, conducting aggressive campaigns against vice regardless of circumstances. Women learned which officers could be negotiated with and which were implacable enemies. The legal system's fundamental hypocrisy was that it criminalized the sellers of sex, but rarely the buyers. Men caught in brothels might be embarrassed, but faced no legal consequences unless they were married and their wives pursued them for adultery. The entire weight of moral and legal condemnation fell on women, despite their far weaker economic position. The Victorian answer to prostitution was the reform home, institutions designed to rescue fallen women and restore them to respectable life through religious instruction, hard work, and moral re-education. Hundreds of such homes operated across Britain, funded by churches, charities, and concerned philanthropists. Entry to reform homes came through various routes. Police courts might sentence women to homes instead of jail. Rescue workers might persuade women on the streets to seek help. Family members might commit women against their will. Some women entered voluntarily, exhausted from street life and hoping for change. Once inside, women faced strict regimes. Days began early with chapel service. Mornings involved laundry work, the standard occupation for reformed prostitutes, considered suitably humble and unmarketable for temptation. Afternoons brought more work, sewing or domestic training. Evenings ended with more prayer, religious instruction, and early bed. The homes were locked. Women couldn't leave without permission, which was rarely granted in the first months. Letters were read, visitors screened, contact with former life severed. The goal was to break old habits and create new ones, to transform prostitutes into domestic servants through discipline and deprivation.
The home's success rates were difficult to assess. Operators claimed high percentages of women successfully rehabilitated, but these numbers were often inflated or based on short-term follow-up. Women who relapsed were quietly removed from statistics. Those who succeeded were held up as proof the system worked, regardless of how many it failed. The underlying philosophy was problematic, assuming prostitutes needed moral rehabilitation rather than economic opportunity. The homes prepared women for servant positions that paid less than prostitution, required longer hours, and offered little independence. Many women made rational calculations that prostitution, despite its risks, offered better options than service. The language surrounding prostitution rescue revealed deep anxieties about class, gender, and sexuality. Reformers spoke of fallen women, white slavery, and moral contagion, using metaphors of disease and degradation. The rhetoric positioned prostitutes as victims requiring rescue, but also as threats to social order requiring containment. W. T. Stead's articles exemplified this rhetoric. He portrayed girls as innocent maidens violated by monstrous men, stolen from virtue through trickery and force. This narrative erased the complex realities of most women's paths into prostitution. The economic pressures, limited options, and often voluntary choices made in desperate circumstances. The victim narrative served reform purposes by generating sympathy and funding, but it also denied women agency. It suggested prostitutes were passive victims rather than people making difficult choices in constrained circumstances. It infantilized adult women, treating them as unable to make decisions about their own bodies and lives. The slavery metaphor was particularly loaded. By comparing prostitution to slavery, reformers invoked powerful moral arguments against the trade. But the comparison was imperfect and sometimes insulting to actual former slaves. Prostitutes could leave their work, though at great cost. They were paid, though poorly. They weren't property, though they were certainly exploited. Some feminist reformers like Josephine Butler criticized this language. They argued women needed economic rights, educational opportunities, and legal protections, not rescue missions that treated them as moral defectives. Butler's campaigns for women's suffrage, property rights, and vocational training reflected a different vision of reform, one based on empowerment rather than salvation. The rescue rhetoric also contained implicit class judgments. Middle-class reformers often seemed more concerned with policing working-class sexuality than with addressing poverty, unemployment, or lack of education. Their vision of successful reform usually involved women accepting servant positions, remaining working class, but now properly disciplined and grateful. For women in service, marriage represented the primary escape route, a path to independence, a home of one's own, and freedom from constant supervision. Young women dreamed of weddings, accumulated trousseau items when they could afford them, and evaluated male acquaintances as potential husbands with cold-eyed practicality. Courtship for servants happened in constrained spaces and limited time. Your afternoon off might be spent walking in the park with a young man, a footman from another house, a tradesman who delivered to the kitchens, a clerk you met at church. The walks were always public, always respectable, always chaperoned by the unspoken presence of your reputation. These courtships moved slowly. You couldn't entertain visitors in your attic room, you couldn't spend evenings together.
You might exchange letters, though the housekeeper read yours first. You met perhaps twice monthly, always in daylight, always careful to return before curfew. Getting to know someone under these conditions took years. The man's prospects mattered enormously. Could he support a wife? Did he have steady employment? Was he sober, reliable, honest? You investigated his character as thoroughly as any detective, asking mutual acquaintances, observing his behavior, watching for warning signs. Marriage to the wrong man meant trading one form of servitude for another, worse one. Some men courted servants with no intention of marriage. They wanted companionship, possibly physical intimacy, but when the time came to commit, they'd disappear or admit they'd been engaged to someone else all along. Women who'd given sexual favors on promises of marriage found themselves ruined, pregnant, unemployed, and unmarriageable. Breach of promise suits existed to address this. If a man proposed marriage, then broke the engagement, the woman could sue for damages. These cases filled courts, with women presenting love letters as evidence and demanding financial compensation for lost prospects. Success depended on having written proof and a sympathetic magistrate. Successful marriages usually required both parties to leave service. Few houses employed married couples except in senior positions like butler and housekeeper. You saved money, gave notice, married, and set up housekeeping in rooms you could barely afford. Your husband worked, hopefully in something stable. You might take in laundry, do sewing, or work in a shop. Money was always tight, but you were free. The transition was often harder than expected. Running a household with no money was different from running one with a full staff and unlimited supplies. Cooking on a small stove, washing without a scullery maid, managing on a budget that left no room for error, these challenges defeated many women who'd been skilled servants. Still, it was yours, your poverty, your struggle, your life. For the adventurous or desperate, emigration offered another escape. The colonies needed servants, wives, and workers. Organizations formed to facilitate emigration, particularly for single women, seeing it as a solution to Britain's surplus women problem and the colony's gender imbalances.
William Thomas Stead was a peculiar figure, part journalist, part crusader, part showman. He genuinely believed in social reform. He also understood that sensational stories sold papers, raised circulation, and gave him power to shape public opinion. The Maiden Tribute articles represented both his best and worst instincts working in tandem. His investigation was real up to a point. He did visit brothels, interview madams, and document the trade in women. But he also staged events, paid for scenarios to unfold that he could then report as spontaneous, and glossed over ethical complications in his methodology. The purchase of Eliza Armstrong, which he thought would prove his point, instead became the scandal that eventually landed him in prison for 3 months for abduction. Stead worked with reform organizations like the Salvation Army and the London Committee for the Suppression of Traffic in British Girls. These groups shared his goals but didn't always approve of his methods. Catherine Booth and Josephine Butler, veteran campaigners for women's rights, found themselves both aided and embarrassed by Stead's crusade. The articles created a template for moral panic journalism that persists today. Take a genuine problem, amplify it with selective examples, add dramatic narratives, ignore complicating factors, and demand immediate legislative action. Stead's writing was brilliant, infuriating, manipulative, and effective all at once. Parliament moved with unusual speed. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 passed just months after Stead's articles appeared. It raised the age of consent from 13 to 16, strengthened penalties for procuring and trafficking, and gave police new powers to raid suspected brothels and rescue houses. But the act contained a poison pill, the Labouchere Amendment, added almost as an afterthought late one night. This clause criminalized all acts of gross indecency between males, whether in public or private. It didn't touch lesbianism, whether because lawmakers couldn't imagine it or didn't want to mention it remains debated. But it created the legal weapon that would eventually be used against Oscar Wilde and thousands of other men over the next century. The connection between prostitution reform and the criminalization of male homosexuality wasn't accidental. Victorian moral reformers saw all non-procreative sexuality as connected, a slippery slope from masturbation to prostitution to same-sex acts. Protecting girls from exploitation and punishing men for sodomy were, in their minds, parts of the same project, disciplining desire to fit within marriage, reproduction, and social order. The immediate effect on prostitution was limited. Police raids increased, some brothels closed, others moved or became more discreet. The age of consent rise mattered more symbolically than practically. Proving that 13-year-olds had sex for money or pleasure had always been difficult, and 16 posed the same evidentiary challenges. What did change was the intensity of surveillance. Rescue workers became more aggressive. Police paid more attention to lodging houses and railway stations. The moral geography of London shifted as neighborhoods were labeled respectable or suspect, and anyone working or living in the wrong areas faced presumption of vice.
Some entered professions as they slowly opened to women. Teaching, nursing, and office work gradually became respectable options for working-class women with sufficient education. These professions paid better than service and offered more dignity, though entry requirements and social prejudice limited access. The most common path to security was widowhood. A woman who'd married, had children, and outlived her husband might find herself relatively independent for the first time. If her husband left any property or savings, she could make her own decisions, run her own household, and enjoy freedoms denied to her entire life. This grim calculus made widowhood something women anticipated rather than dreaded. Success was almost always relative rather than absolute. A woman didn't rise from scullery maid to lady of leisure. She rose from desperate poverty to moderate security, from total dependence to limited independence, from voicelessness to small influence. These incremental improvements were victories in a system designed to keep women in subordinate positions. The handful of truly successful women became proof that the system worked, that virtue and industry were rewarded. This logic conveniently ignored the thousands who worked just as hard and remained trapped in poverty. Success required not just effort, but luck, connections, timing, and often privileges like education or family support that most lacked. For every woman who escaped service or prostitution, dozens remained trapped. They aged into less desirable positions, their bodies broken by years of heavy labor. They cycled through employer after employer, never quite succeeding, but never quite failing enough to be completely excluded from employment. Old servants faced particular hardship. Once your health failed or your appearance aged beyond acceptability, positions dried up. Employers wanted young, strong workers. An aging maid might be kept on in a long-time household out of loyalty, but if dismissed or if the household dissolved, finding new placement became nearly impossible. Some ended in workhouses, Victorian poorhouses that housed the indigent, elderly, and disabled. These institutions were deliberately unpleasant to discourage use, offering minimal food, hard work, and separation of married couples. They were places of last resort, refuges for those with absolutely nowhere else to go. Others turned to street prostitution in old age, selling sex for pennies to men with minimal standards. These women haunted docksides and slum streets, visible reminders of what awaited those who fell through society's cracks. Their lives were short and brutal, ending in disease, violence, or exposure. A fortunate few found places in almshouses, charitable institutions for respectable poor elderly. These required proof of good character, years of residence in a parish, and recommendations from worthy citizens. They offered basic shelter and support, allowing dignified poverty rather than abject destitution. The absence of any social safety net made old age terrifying. There was no pension, no retirement, no guaranteed care. You worked until you physically couldn't, then depended on charity or family who often couldn't afford to support you. The Victorian emphasis on self-reliance and individual responsibility left the elderly poor to suffer the consequences of structural economic failures. These stories, the ones without happy endings, were the majority. Most women lived hard lives, worked until their bodies gave out, and died without ever achieving comfort or security. Their names weren't recorded in memoirs. Their stories didn't become novels. They existed in statistics, workhouse registers, and burial records, remarkable only for how unremarkable their suffering was. The Victorian period's approach to women, work, and sexuality shaped British society for generations. Many institutions and attitudes persisted well into the 20th century, only gradually eroding under pressure from feminism, economic change, and social reform. Domestic service continued as a major employer of women through the 1930s. World War I created labor shortages that pulled women into factories and offices, showing that alternatives existed. But in the interwar years, service recovered, though never to Victorian levels. Working-class women still entered service, still lived in, still faced rigid hierarchies and limited freedom. The Second World War finished what the first began. Women entered industry, military service, and professional work in unprecedented numbers. Afterward, they refused to return entirely to domestic service. The combination of full employment, rising wages, and welfare state provisions meant women had options. Service declined rapidly, becoming a marginal occupation rather than the default for working-class women. The treatment of unmarried mothers slowly improved. Though shame and coercion persisted into the 1970s, forced adoption remained common. Reform homes and mother and baby homes operated well into the 1980s in Ireland and longer elsewhere. The fundamental judgment that women who had children outside of marriage were morally defective survived Victoria by a century. Prostitution remained criminalized at the edges, legal in itself but surrounded by illegal activities. The focus shifted from brothels to street solicitation, from madam to pimp, but the basic dynamics of policing women while ignoring men continued. Prostitutes continued to face violence, poverty, and legal harassment, though some areas experimented with more pragmatic approaches. The rescue narrative persisted in modified forms. White slavery as the panic du jour, with similar rhetorical strategies, emphasizing innocence, denying agency, and calling for rescue operations that often harmed the people they claimed to help. The Victorian pattern of moral panic leading to legislation that criminalized rather than protected continued.
The day begins in darkness and cold. You wake to muscle memory rather than desire, your body understanding before your mind that resistance is futile. The attic is so cold you can see your breath. Your uniform, black dress, white apron, cap, hangs where you left it, and you pull it on over your chemise with practiced efficiency. In the darkness, you navigate to the washstand. The water in the pitcher has ice on its surface. You break through it to splash your face, gasping at the shock. There is no time for more elaborate washing. That will come tonight if you have energy left. Down the narrow servants' stairs, you move like a shadow. The house above still sleeps, and your job is to ensure it wakes to comfort without ever seeing the labor that creates it. You pass other servants on similar missions,
the scullery maid heading to the kitchen, the parlor maid with her box of cleaning supplies, everyone moving in synchronized silence. Your first task is the fires. The family must wake to warm rooms. You carry coal scuttles up the main stairs, the family hasn't risen yet, so you're allowed to use them, and kneel at cold grates to clean out yesterday's ashes. Your hands are soon black, your knees ache against the hearth. But you work quickly, efficiently, building fires that will catch and burn steadily through the morning. Each fire is a small engineering project. Paper and kindling at the base, coal arranged just so, lighting it in the right spot to ensure it catches properly. You've learned through bitter experience what happens when you build a fire wrong. The smokeback that fills the room, the flames that die before the coal catches, the waste of precious fuel that results in scolding from the housekeeper. By 5:30, you've lit 6 fires and emptied the chamber pots from the bedrooms, carrying them down the servants' stairs to the outdoor privy, a task that never becomes less revolting. You wash your hands in cold water with harsh soap that cracks your skin, then move to the next phase of your morning. Breakfast preparation belongs mostly to the kitchen staff, but you help carry things, the heavy trays of dishes, the silver that needs polishing, the water that must be heated in enormous quantities. The kitchen is the only warm room in the house at this hour, and you linger there as long as you dare, knowing the housekeeper will scold if she catches you idling.
The houses you work in are designed to keep you invisible. Servants' stairs twist narrow and steep behind walls, allowing you to move between floors without being seen. Service hallways run parallel to family corridors, doors cleverly concealed in wallpaper or paneling. The back stairs world is dim and utilitarian. Plain walls, bare floors, no ornament. The green baize door marks the boundary between worlds. Through it lies the servants' domain, the servants' hall, the housekeeper's room, the butler's pantry, the kitchen, scullery, and larder. Your side is all business: stone floors, scrubbed tables, hooks for copper pots, shelves stacked with supplies. Push through the door in the other direction, and you enter luxury. Thick carpets that muffle sound, wallpaper in rich patterns, paintings in gold frames, furniture that costs more than you'll earn in a decade. You're trained to move through these spaces like air, there but not really, visible only when needed, vanishing the moment attention shifts elsewhere. The bells are your constant companions. Each room has a pull cord that connects to bells in the servants' hall, labeled with room names: morning room, drawing room, master's study, mistress's bedroom. When a bell rings, you note which one and respond accordingly. The family never shouts for service. Too vulgar. They ring, and servants come. Learning the household's geography takes weeks. Which stairs lead where? Which rooms you're allowed to enter, and which are forbidden even to clean without supervision. Where supplies are kept, which doors are locked, and where the keys hang. The fastest routes from one part of the house to another. You become a master of back entrances and side passages. Tradesmen come to the servants' entrance, never the front door. You know every delivery schedule: the butcher on Monday and Thursday, the greengrocer on Wednesday, the fishmonger on Friday. You know which of these tradesmen can be trusted and which will shortchange the cook if she's not watching. The spatial segregation extends to mealtimes. The family eats in the dining room at appointed hours. You eat in the servants' hall at different times, often from different food. The separation is psychological as much as physical, reminding everyone of their place, maintaining the fiction that the family exists in a perfect world untouched by the labor that sustains it.
This tension has practical implications. If we see prostitutes as pure victims, we support policies that rescue and rehabilitate regardless of what women themselves want. If we see them as pure agents, freely choosing their work, we ignore economic desperation and limited alternatives. A better approach would ask women what they need, likely boring things like housing, healthcare, childcare, and living wage employment, rather than either rescue or celebration. Victorian society worked hard to forget the women we've discussed. Servants were meant to be invisible, their labor creating comfort while they themselves remained unseen. Prostitutes were relegated to the shadows, spoken of in whispers, their existence acknowledged only as moral warnings. Working-class women generally disappeared from official histories focused on great men, political events, and imperial expansion. This forgetting was deliberate. Acknowledging servants' humanity would have required confronting the exploitation on which comfortable life depended. Recognizing prostitutes as economic actors rather than moral failures would have undermined the sexual double standard. Taking working-class women seriously as historical subjects would have challenged the narratives of progress and benevolent hierarchy Victorian culture told itself. Recovering these stories requires patient archival work, reading against the grain of official documents, finding women's voices in court records and reform reports, using statistical data to reconstruct patterns of employment and survival. It means taking seriously sources that weren't meant to preserve women's perspectives and finding meaning in fragments and silences. It also means reckoning with our own investments in certain narratives. We want to believe in progress, that things got better, that reforms worked, that history bends toward justice. Victorian women's history complicates this story. Changes happen slowly, unevenly, incompletely. Some things improved while others persisted or worsened. Progress wasn't inevitable, and victories were often limited and fragile. We also want heroines, women who resisted courageously, spoke truth to power, changed history through force of will. Some Victorian women did these things: Josephine Butler fighting the CD Acts, Annie Besant organizing women workers, Florence Nightingale transforming nursing. But most women's heroism was quieter, surviving another day, protecting their children, helping a fellow servant, saving a few pennies toward an uncertain future. Beyond the statistics and patterns, Victorian women's lives had texture, small pleasures and pains that made each day distinct. The servant who found a moment to read a discarded newspaper, absorbing news of the wider world. The prostitute who laughed with a colleague over a pompous client's absurdity. The lady's maid who took pride in perfectly dressed hair. The cook whose pastry earned genuine compliments. These moments didn't erase exploitation or suffering. A kind word from an employer didn't compensate for 16-hour days. A moment of laughter didn't undo poverty's grinding effects. But human beings can find joy and meaning, even in difficult circumstances, can build relationships and communities, even in exploitative systems, can maintain dignity and humor despite indignity and suffering. Acknowledging this complexity doesn't minimize injustice. It simply recognizes that people are more than their suffering. Victorian servants were workers, exploited by an unjust system, and also women with friends, crushes, ambitions, private jokes, and inner lives. Prostitutes were economically coerced into selling sex, and also people with preferences, boundaries, survival strategies, and moments of happiness. The daily texture of life, getting dressed in a freezing attic, gossiping over breakfast, dealing with a difficult employer, meeting a follower in the park, laughing at a joke, crying over a letter from home. This is where history happened, not just in Parliament passing laws or reformers giving speeches, but in millions of small moments that made up individual lives. Writing about Victorian women from our vantage point carries responsibilities and risks. We know how things turned out, which reforms succeeded, which movements prevailed, which strategies failed. This hindsight can make us judgmental, criticizing historical actors for not seeing what we see, not doing what we think they should have done. But they didn't have our knowledge. A servant in 1885 couldn't know that service would decline dramatically within decades. A prostitute couldn't predict antibiotics would make sexually transmitted infections manageable. A reformer couldn't foresee how her efforts would play out over generations.
They made decisions based on information available to them in contexts we can only partially reconstruct. We also bring our own biases and blind spots. 21st century readers have different values than Victorian people. We might prioritize individual freedom over social order, sexual autonomy over respectability, material comfort over moral virtue. These different values make Victorian choices seem incomprehensible or outrageous, but they were coherent within their own moral frameworks, even when we find those frameworks deeply flawed. The challenge is to understand Victorian choices without endorsing them, to take seriously the constraints people faced without excusing exploitation, to recognize complexity without abandoning ethical judgment. We can simultaneously acknowledge that servants made real choices within limited options and condemn the system that limited their options. We can respect prostitutes' agency while fighting the poverty that often drove them into sex work. This balance is difficult to maintain. It's easier to tell simple stories of pure victims or free agents, of steady progress or unchanging oppression, of heroes and villains. But real history is messy, contradictory, full of gray areas and difficult questions. Honoring Victorian women's experiences means sitting with that messiness rather than resolving it into tidy narratives. What do we owe the Victorian women whose stories we've explored? First, memory itself. Most died in obscurity, their names forgotten, their experiences erased. Simply telling their stories, acknowledging their existence matters. They lived, worked, suffered, laughed, loved, and died. They deserve to be remembered as people, rather than statistics or symbols.
Second, honest reckoning. We should acknowledge the exploitation they faced without romanticizing their suffering or their survival. Service was exploitative. Prostitution was often desperate. Reform homes were controlling. The system was unjust. Saying so doesn't diminish women's agency or strength. It names the reality they navigated. Third, learning from their experiences. The patterns that shaped Victorian women's lives, economic inequality, gender discrimination, sexual double standards, the devaluation of reproductive labor, persist in modified forms. Understanding how these systems worked historically helps us recognize and challenge them in the present. Fourth, respecting complexity. Real women were neither angels nor villains, neither pure victims nor unconstrained agents. They made difficult choices in impossible situations. They resisted and complied. They survived through combinations of strength, luck, compromise, and community. Honoring them means accepting this complexity rather than forcing them into simple categories. Fifth, continuing their struggles. Victorian women fought for rights, resources, and recognition. Many of those struggles remain unfinished. Economic inequality persists. Care work remains undervalued. Sex workers face criminalization and violence. Paying tribute to Victorian women means continuing to fight for the things they wanted: dignity, security, choice, and justice.
As we come to the end of this journey through Victorian women's lives, the night is deep and quiet around you. You've walked below stairs with the servants, stood on street corners with prostitutes, sat in reform homes with women seeking change, and witnessed the scandals that shook Victorian Britain. These women were your great-great-grandmothers, your ancestors in spirit, if not blood. They cleaned the houses, cooked the meals, raised the children, and performed the labor, paid and unpaid, legal and illegal, that kept Victorian society functioning. They did this without recognition, often without dignity, rarely with justice. Their struggles weren't in vain. The reforms they fought for, the small resistances they mounted, the choices they made within constrained options, all of these mattered. The world changed slowly, incompletely, but it changed. You inherit the fruits of their labor and their courage. As you drift towards sleep, spare a thought for the young woman waking at 4:30 in a freezing attic, for the woman walking cold streets looking for clients, for the woman locked in a reform home yearning for freedom, for the woman who emigrated seeking a better life, for the woman who married hoping for escape, for the countless women whose names we'll never know, but whose lives we've tried to honor. Their ghosts walk with us still, in every conversation about care work and economic justice, in every debate about sex work and criminalization, in every fight for women's rights and economic security. We stand on their shoulders, benefit from their struggles, and bear responsibility for finishing the work they began. Sleep well, knowing that every day of comfort you enjoy was built by women like these. Women who worked crushing hours for minimal pay. Women who survived impossible situations through courage and creativity. Women who refused to disappear no matter how hard society tried to erase them. The Victorian era is gone, but its lessons remain. Economic exploitation takes new forms, but follows old patterns. Agency and structure still dance their complicated dance. Women still fight for rights, resources, and recognition. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it echoes. And in those echoes, we can hear the voices of Victorian women reminding us to keep fighting, keep surviving, keep working toward the world they dreamed of but never lived to see. Rest now. The stories have been told. The ghosts have been honored. Tomorrow you'll wake to a world shaped by their labor and their courage. A world still requiring your own labor and courage to make it more just. But tonight, simply rest. Grateful for the distance we've traveled from the freezing attics and dangerous streets of Victorian Britain, humbled by the distance still to travel. Good night.